Hello, and welcome to tonight's Bull session where we're going to be discussing Anchuli Felicia King's new play, Keene. My name is Nathan Winkelstein. I'm the Associate Artistic Director of Red Bull Theater, and I'm thrilled that you are all here tonight. We did this reading just this past Monday in association with American Shakespeare Center. I imagine most of you who are here tonight have watched that. If you haven't, you have until tomorrow at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to watch it, or to tell all your friends to watch it before it disappears for forever. So please do get on that. Before we get going tonight, I want to talk a little bit about the functionality of the evening. As you know, there's a Q&A portion to tonight's discussion. You'll see at the bottom of your screen that there is indeed a Q&A option. And if you go in there, you can type your question. You will probably not see other people's questions, so don't feel like, oh no, I'm the only person asking. There probably are other people asking, you're just not seeing them, so go for it. And if you are also interested in asking your question live yourself, then what you should do is type the question into the Q&A and also click the raise hand function. And then if your question is chosen to be answered during discussion, the moderator will see that your hand is raised, which means that you want to answer it, you want to ask it verbally, and then we'll give you permission to turn on your speaker and off we'll go. If you have a question that you don't want to ask yourself, that doesn't make it less likely to be answered. Just type it right in. Conversely, don't just raise your hand. You won't be called on unless you write a question. Got it. Great. So, on that note, I want to introduce your moderator for tonight's discussion. Her name is Anne Morgan. She is the resident dramaturg and literary manager at American Shakespeare Center. And she also helms Shakespeare's New Contemporaries, ASC's groundbreaking initiative to discover, develop, and produce new work in conversation with Shakespeare's plays. Hi, Anne.
Hi, thanks so much for having me.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for doing it. I'm normally the one who moderates these. I get to just sort of sit easy and watch the questions. It's great. Uh, but I'd love, before we get going and introduce everyone else, can you tell us a little bit, because of course most of the Red Bull audience at least doesn't know a whole lot about this Shakespeare's New Contemporaries program, which is where you found the script Keene. Could you tell us a little bit about the history of that?
Sure. So, Shakespeare's New Contemporaries, as Nathan so beautifully put it, discovers, develops, and produces new plays that are in conversation with Shakespeare. And the way we do this is once a year or so, we announce a handful of Shakespeare titles that we're looking for responses to. And we are looking for plays that not only engage in an interrogation of the particular Shakespeare text, but we're also looking for plays that embrace the theatrical potential of Shakespeare's staging conditions, which is how we produce at the Blackfriars Playhouse at the American Shakespeare Center. So that includes things like universal shared lighting, a much larger cast size than you might see elsewhere, and things like that. So there's really sort of two pieces, both the play and the sort of structural components of it that make it a good fit for Shakespeare's New Contemporaries. So we put out a call for plays that responded to Othello, and this stunning piece of writing came through our door. So Keene was selected as a winner for the project in early 2019. It had a cold staged reading at ASC's Blackfriars Conference last fall, which is also where I first heard our guest scholar David Sterling Brown speak about his research. And the play subsequently had a workshop process with ASC where the script was developed further. ASC had planned to be producing the world premiere right about now, and those plans have been put on pause in this moment of pandemic, but we are so glad to have this opportunity to work on the play more, to work with Red Bull, to share it with this audience. So that's sort of like a little bit of conversation context for the Shakespeare's New Contemporaries piece of the conversation. And if I may, I'd love to first bring sort of into the panel our scholar, David Sterling Brown, and our playwright and truly Felicia King.
So,
And they're both much more attractive and interesting than me, so I'm going to hide my camera and let you two have fun, and I'll be hiding in the background. Enjoy the discussion.
thank
Thanks,
you.
Nathan.
Too kind.
I am so excited to dig into this play. And I want to start really with a perhaps deceptively simple question for you, David, which was just to ask you about your initial response to the play. How did you react when you read it? And what made you say yes when Red Bull invited you to be involved in this process?
Sure. Well, simple answer to that question because there's a lot to say, but I will echo you in saying that the play is stunning. It really resonated with me on a lot of different levels. And when I got this script from Jesse Berger, I felt a gravitational pull from the script in just even the way that it articulates what's going on with early career researchers at a Shakespeare conference, both the anxiety as well as the coping mechanisms that really stuck out to me a lot. But also even the procrastination, which can be a big part of this game, no matter what level you're at in the profession. But more specifically, the first 3 or 5 pages were just pretty gripping for me in terms of the overt interrogation of whiteness, and the willingness to go there and just dive right in. That was one of the things that I appreciated, particularly in the ways that it recalled for me even aspects of Jordan Peele's film Get Out, and what's going on there as well. And I also chose to accept this invitation because the play is direct in the way that it confronts and interrogates whiteness as opposed to being passive. And even just, again, in those first few pages, thinking about whiteness as an unstable concept. And also, I love the way that Felicia defines what whiteness is by saying it's a 3-day Shakespeare conference. There's a lot to unpack there in terms of thinking about how whiteness is being defined. And then the last thing I would say is the play does a brilliant job of weaving together fiction and nonfiction. And so for people who come into the play unfamiliar with Ira Aldridge and his history, the history of the African Grove Theater in the early 19th century, and the African Free School, for instance, that's really, really important history that people need to know. History that then bleeds into trajectory of other Black actors who participate in Shakespeare's, theater on the stage. And so I guess the very last thing I would say, though, is on a personal, critical, experiential level, I could walk away from this play almost feeling like I am Tyler, which is really sort of the sticking point for me. And I think there's a lot to be said about that as well, in terms of the experience of, I've never been the only Black scholar at a Shakespeare conference, but sometimes it feels that way. And so that really resonated for me.
Great. And Felicia, I know as well that, and I think we'll sort of tie this in, I hope, at some point in our conversation, that part of this play was inspired by your own experience at a Shakespeare conference.
Yeah.
David, sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, continue.
I want to sort of dig a little deeper, and you've sort of already started to touch on some of this. In the play, at the top of Act 2, the chorus says, Kai is overwhelmed by this sudden shift, the transition from abject invisibility to overwhelming visibility, from ostracization to fetishization. And in your program note, you write, it is in this sea of whiteness that Tyler and Kai stand out, paradoxically becoming visible and invisible in distinct dramatic moments, emphasizing the kind of uncomfortable hypervisibility that is a byproduct of the psychologically and emotionally harmful racism, exoticism, exceptionalism, and tokenism one can experience in predominantly white spaces. So I'd love to hear you speak a bit more about how you understand visibility and invisibility operating in Felicia's play, and how that may or may not connect to the same issues in Shakespeare's body of work, his plays, and within the Shakespeare field.
Yeah, sure. That's a big question, a loaded question. Actually, I'm appreciative of the Exploring Othello series because I saw that Felicia had attended a Shakespeare conference. I heard you say that, and so for me, it was like, okay, this is starting to make a little more sense to me. Is how'd you get so inside of what's going on? But the visibility and invisibility. I guess thinking about the latter part of the play, one of the things that was really both heartening but also sad for me was how the play suggests that the work is what makes the person visible as opposed to the person making the work visible. And so we see that at the end when Kai has done this presentation and she gets this invitation to contribute to a journal. Meanwhile, no one has seen her, really. I mean, she's been at the conference, but no one's seen her. And because Tyler misses that opportunity because of his wonderful graduate school colleague, he doesn't get to present his paper. And, he becomes invisible. The person who he sleeps with the night before this, she doesn't see him when he walks into the bar, basically. And so it really made me think, and I don't know what to do with this, but there's definitely, again, a huge commentary there on how there's this tension between both the work and the person and which one matters more. And for me, it's obvious which one matters more. It is the person. And so even though, Tyler doesn't die at the end of this text, it almost felt like he did, because he essentially feels like his career is over because, and it hasn't even really started. He's in graduate school, but he's dug himself into a deep hole in terms of missing that opportunity, which also rendered him invisible. The play also makes visible, as I was suggesting before, just that rich history of Black actors and specifically Ira Aldridge, but also his journey from being in, New York City in, 1823, 1824, and then moving across the Atlantic and having to sort of adopt a persona over there, if you will, and become who he became. And, I think that's one of the things that makes this play really interesting too, is the sort of triangulation between Aldridge, Othello, and Tyler, and how in their different ways, even though society's racism has at times rendered them visible or invisible, like we don't hear, I did not learn about Ira Aldridge in high school, for instance, or even college for that matter. And so there's real important historical work that I think this play is doing by drawing on and building on Shakespeare's work. And then in terms of the play, Othello's this hyper visible Black figure. And I loved what was going on the screen with a lot of the times Tyler Square being bigger than the other ones, which didn't necessarily make you see him any better, even though, again, optically, that was the point, right? He's got the biggest square. We should be paying most attention to him, but it's the chorus around him. It's Dana. It's all the people who don't fit in with the idea of Blackness that we direct our attention to. And that has a lot to do with the sort of gravitational pull of whiteness. And I think that's one of the lovely sort of critical aspects of this play.
Terrific, thank you. Lots to chew on there. Felicia, I want to ask you a little bit about the process, as David so beautifully spoke to, the sort of, you've got the Othello piece, you've got the Ira Aldridge piece, and then you have the Tyler piece. And what I think is also really important about this play is that it is not an adaptation or a translation. You yourself in your playwright's note refer to it as a thematic riff operating in its own dramatic universe. And I'm wondering if you can let us into the process of writing the play, and specifically how you created this dramatic universe and how you were thinking about putting it in conversation with those layers that I mentioned.
Yeah, it felt super important to me that the play be able. Oh, first off, I wanted to say thank you, David, for that incredibly incisive and beautiful deconstruction of my play. It's really scary and wonderful to have someone speak so smartly about your own work. Yeah, it felt really important to me that it exists as a work that you could consume without any foreknowledge of Othello or even of Ira Aldridge. In part because I have seen a lot of referential theater to Shakespeare. I mean, it's such a huge canon of plays that respond to Shakespeare's work, and I've always found myself feeling quite alienated by plays that are heavily referential to the point that you feel like if you don't know the canon well, you can't engage with that play. It feels almost elitist. And so, yeah, it felt really important to me that the play conflate the sort of like high art of Shakespeare with sort of pop culture and this sort of accessible love story that felt really universal. In terms of the process of researching it and writing it, I knew that I wanted to respond to Othello when the plays for the SNC prize got released. And I didn't really know what my entry point was going to be, because I was sort of like, I'm not really sure if it is my play to respond to, and I'm sort of scared by the play and intrigued by the play. And so part of trying to work out what I was going to write about, knowing in the back of my brain that I wanted to sort of have a Shakespeare conference be at the center of it, because I just been to a Shakespeare conference, was just researching the performance history of the play and getting really, really fascinated by Ira Aldridge and biographies about him. And I think just in general, I'm really interested in the early 19th century. And its legacy, particularly in sort of like theatrical culture, because I think we've inherited a lot of our practices and structures from that period of theater history. So yeah, in researching the life of Ira Aldridge, I started to see a lot of parallels between what contemporary academics of color were experiencing in terms of that fetishization, in terms of the sort of issue of hypervisibility, but also exceptionalism and being valued for your exceptionalism in a white canon, in a white society. So starting to draw those parallels. But it was also really important to me that the play, because it's a sort of dreamlike 19th century and it's very much Tyler's impressionistic dreaming of Ira, that it wasn't like you get all the information that you need about Ira's life and backstory, but it's not a historically accurate retelling, and it's far more about Tyler's relationship to his subject than it is sort of a straight history.
We are also lucky to be joined tonight by two of our performers from Monday evening. Sarah Suzuki, who played Kai, and Zoe Spies, who played chorus number 5. Awesome. And I want to throw a question to all 4 of you, which has to do with genre. I think one of the things that's great about this moment, maybe that wasn't the right phrasing, but great about this medium is that we are able to connect across distance and time zones in ways that we might not be able to. We are able to have this conversation. But one of the things that I especially miss with particular regard to this play is laughter. And I have seen live readings of this play, and I know it gets a lot of laughs, both laughs that are prompted by the humor of the play and laughs that may be prompted by recognition or discomfort. And so I'd love to hear from y'all, sort of from your respective roles, how does comedy work in this play, and how do genre and style impact the conversation that's happening between Keene and Othello?
Well, there's definitely a flow that exists in Keene that I'm really enamored by, especially with the choruses. The way the play starts is with this beautiful sort of almost musical flow of language to establish where we are, what we're talking about, the time, the setting, the place. It's very efficient, and I love uses of chorus in contemporary plays, especially. I think that's just my sort of latent Greek theater fandom that exists from college. And so one thing about Zoom that I was nervous about, and I think our director was aware of too, is that there is just an ability to sort of really play the dashes that sort of end incomplete lines in person, because you can sort of play it on the heartbeat and really step on top of each other. But we have factors we can't control online, like internet delays and sorry, missed my place, scroll. And so I thought for our reading, actually, as things magically do, it actually had some nice flow for an online reading. But that is something really specifically beautiful about the dialogue in Keene, that I think leads to some of the funniest moments in the play. It's just the sort of musicality of it. You can almost see it on like a musical sheet, you know, like the notes and the tempo. And so I think that's wonderfully done. And that's where I think the comedy comes from too.
Yeah. I also think for me, as a Black man watching this play, a lot of the comedy, I found it in moments where there were the most bracing critiques of whiteness. And so because I understand it, I've seen it, I've seen it play out. It wasn't uncomfortable for me. It was funny in that sort of familiar way. But I wonder, because I had a conversation after I watched Get Out with my Shakespeare and race colleague, Arthur Little of UCLA. And we both noticed how when we were in the theater in sort of white spaces, the white audience members were not laughing at the same times that we were laughing. And so I could imagine, I would love to be in the theater space and watch Keene and see how the audiences respond to it, because I can imagine across racial lines it will be different for people. So that was one of the things I thought about the laughter.
Yeah, I can relate to that. When I first read this play, I was just like, oh yeah, that is what it's like to be the only person of color in a room full of white people. Oh God. And there are parts in this play that I think are just so funny because they're so true to what my experience has been as a person of color, like especially in Shakespeare. And what is funny about this play too is that how well it does that. But then also Kai and Tyler by design.
That's the couple name, Kyler.
Tyler, yeah. That's totally what I totally meant to do that. But by design are the only two actors of color in the cast, and it's just interesting to have to, as an actor of color, have to also realize that we're kind of like creating this discomfort, but also kind of funny situation in the room, at least among the actors. So yeah, I mean, I just relate to that part of the comedy of it all, just sort of like watching the white people do their white people thing, and then just like sitting back and watching it happen and just finding it kind of funny.
Yeah.
Well, something you said, David, too, also, so in performing Othello, which our season just closed here last Sunday at the American Shakespeare Center, I played Rodrigo in Othello, which I found to be a pretty funny character. I think, you can find in Rodrigo whatever you want, just like with every character. But there was definitely a sense of the comedy that character produces, the laughs that character produces, would be drastically different if the composition of our audience wasn't what it was, and I could absolutely feel on nights that we had a slightly more diverse audience that we have, I mean, we're in the mountains of Stanton, Virginia, so things only kind of go so far, but the laughter that I elicited as Rodrigo and the laughter that Iago elicits if we were in a room that was totally flipped, for the most part, those audiences were primarily white, and they would laugh at Iago's jokes. And that is a way I think of that Shakespeare uses of sort of pulling the audience along with you to trap you into sort of the schemes that he executes. But if that was the opposite and John Harrell was performing Iago to a room of primarily people of color, I do not think that the responses would be the same. And it would be a fascinating performance to witness and also to participate in if he didn't have the sort of advantage of comedy serving the people who matched the skin tone of the person sort of uttering what's funny. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And we thought about that a lot, and it's just an experiment and an experience that we never really got to have here, but one day maybe.
Yeah, no, because I mean, with that, I love what you just said, Zoe, because, with the laughter that comes with watching Othello, which I don't laugh when I watch that play, it makes the audience members who do laugh complicit in, whether they know it or not, they become complicit in what's going on as far as the racism and the violence, the psychological violence that's happening to Othello in particular. They become complicit in that. And that's another sort of aspect of Keene that I liked as well. And just there's a psychological component to it too. That I, hope we can maybe talk about as well.
I think we could absolutely just sort of like free form keep going, but we are getting some questions from our audience. So I want to start with Josie, who has had her hand up for a while, and Josie, I'm going to allow you to talk. So you should be able to
Hello.
ask your question. Hi.
Hi. Yes, I was just, I may have not been, basically my question was, I was a bit confused by the ending, especially with the relationship between Kai and her imaginary Tyler, is that right? I was just curious, is it to show that is she like getting past her own subconscious racial fears? Because I know that everyone has subconscious racial fears that they're not aware of. Or is she like getting past her own fear of connecting with others beyond her comfort zone? I was just curious about that.
Thanks for that question, Josie. That's actually, it's a question that I feel like we get asked at Q&As we've been asked before. And it's something that in the card draft of the play, I left ambiguous intentionally. And part of that is, internalized racism, particularly when it comes to romantic relationships, is really amorphous and difficult to define. And part of the repeated theme in the play is Kai sort of having to grapple with what it means to have fallen in love with a Black man. But then also one of the other themes in the play is if you feel something in excess, particularly if you sort of love something to excess, how crippling that can be. And so, yeah, the play sort of leaves intentionally ambiguous and up to the audience to read into why it is that Kai feels she can't go to Tyler. And I think both of those readings are sort of part and parcel of her at the end of that. Sarah, do you have any feelings on that after playing her?
Yeah, my interpretation of it was more paralysis in terms of any sort of relationship, and the way that it reads thematically might be different than the way that, I have to play it to be able to play it, but my interpretation of it is that the massive sort of violent falling in love is so emotionally, disturbing in some ways that it can't, to move at all is to sort of continue, it's terrifying. And then on top of that, to fall in love with someone who lives in a different country, who speaks a different language, who you may never see again, like it might just be opening the door to heartache and just utter depression. And so, I think that dream that she has at the end is somewhat grappling with that fear, that like deep fear of, putting yourself out there and then not being able to follow through, or to not being able to it not being what you want it to be. And I kind of appreciate that it's ambiguous at the end, because then, we can kind of hope that she, they talk at the end and she gets a tenured position at, wherever at NYU and he's at Columbia, and then they can like meet in the, like we can hope that happens. But, now we can sort of use our imagination. Yeah.
David, what do you make of the end of the play?
I really liked the end of the play in terms of the coming together of their singing in particular, and the sort of overlay and the infusion of the different languages there, because one, I got to this place where I felt for Tyler, but when I look back at the beginning of the play and I think about the critiques that again were a little too accurate, Felicia, in terms of just the monotony of the conversations that happen at these conferences, right? And so I almost got the sense that the people weren't people, that they were more so automatons or robotic in both the ways that they ask questions, but also the questions that they ask. The dreaded dissertation, like I've heard that 1,000 times. And so it was really nice at the end I interpreted them coming together at the end and the music in addition to the love, but just showing them as people doing something that people do. They're not talking about Shakespeare, they were singing music. And it was fabulous, it was beautiful. And it made me see them as people that sort of stood out, I think, among the other sort of choral figures in the play.
I think as well, and I think we'll hit on some of this as we continue talking, but I think there's something about the sort of ending with a song that also just feels very Shakespearean to me.
Sure. Yes.
That it just is like, that is the sort of note we end on. We have a question from Ellen, who says, we saw this performed essentially as a reading and a Zoom reading at that. Do you think this could be staged more fully as a play? I will jump in and say, yes, we hope so. And if so, how do you envision staging it? And Felicia, if I could tack my own question onto that as well, I'd love to hear you speak a little bit about how Shakespeare's staging conditions impacted your writing.
Yeah, so part of the creative invitation of SNC is to write for like Shakespeare's original staging conditions. And I found it to be an incredibly freeing exercise as a playwright, because you need to give the audience all of the information. Like, you can't rely on any contemporary staging elements to paint a picture. You sort of, which is part of the reason that the chorus functions the way that it does. But I definitely had a sort of revelatory moment the first time that I actually walked into the theater and started envisioning the play for that space. Because I think, and I hope that when we get to do a production of this play, whenever it happens, like, you have such an opportunity to like envelop the audience in the play, in that space, and get really creative with making them feel like they're in the world of the play, even though you don't have any design elements. Like, it's part of what's really magical about like those Elizabethan theaters, is you have so many entrances and exits. You can really play with like balcony space. And so and part of what I found really exciting about being in the space as well is it's so well suited to like music. And it's such a, it feels like the feedback loop between the audience and the play is so much closer than it is in a different kind of theater. So just making the audience feel that like immediacy and being like enveloped by the world of the play is something that I really hope we can bring out in production.
Awesome. We have a question from Mary and Harry, who asked, and I'm going to do the same thing I just did, which is like, their question is in line with one that I already had, so I'm going to try and weave them together. Mary and Harry say, given the playwright's statement that she wanted to avoid a Shakespeare referential play, didn't she sneak in Ian equals Iago, question mark, or am I all wet here? And I want to we'll start there and then to sort of build off of that. I know, Felicia, you have been part of Red Bull's weekly Othello seminar, and you said at the beginning of that experience, when I was writing a response play to Othello, I also had to give myself some necessary distance from the play. So I'm curious to hear, have these seminar sessions and this sort of deeper dive into Othello impacted your thinking of your own play? And for the whole rest of the panel, has your experience of or work on Keene impacted your understanding of Othello?
It's a really great question. Yeah, it's been amazing to participate in this panel series and get to do like really, really close textual analysis of Othello, which is something that I hadn't done since I was in undergrad. And so like part of when I started writing this play, I decided pretty early on that I wasn't gonna intensely revisit the play. Like I wasn't gonna read, like I had done that in grad school and in undergrad, I'd studied the play a couple of times. And I was like, I'll just try and rely on sort of what I remember from studying the play and try not to get too deep into critical analysis and focus on the performance history instead. And so I think what comes through in the play, like with Ian, with a number of the thematic riffs around jealousy and sabotage and even sort of like plot devices that mirror things in Othello, it's a very sort of broad strokes macro thematic riff. You know, it doesn't get into the minutiae and it's not, and those references are snuck in there as well, like and not just to Othello, you know, like there are references snuck into a bunch of different things, so that the audience can sort of, if you do have that thematic reference, you can sort of enjoy making those parallels, but the success is not contingent on having that knowledge. So yeah, hang on. What was the second part of that question, Anne?
The second part was if your participation in the Red Bull Othello seminar has impacted how you're thinking about the play now.
Yeah, it certainly has. And part of what's been amazing about doing this series is thinking really deeply about genre, thinking about comedy, how comedy functions in Othello. And the generic uneasiness of that play, that it sort of oscillates between tragedy and comedy, and how like your interpretation of different moments radically affects how you sort of receive that play. But it's also been quite heartening in getting to do a close reading for me to rediscover parallels between the play that I wrote and Othello, and things that I hadn't previously noticed. So I definitely do think that in going back and sort of revising the play or relooking at it, this will have hugely impacted my thinking on it.
And to the rest of the panel, how has your perspective on Othello shifted at all? And if so, how?
There was one theme in Othello that I found very interesting that sort of overlapped with Keene, which is the theme of alcohol and drunkenness, and Cassio's sort of getting progressively more drunk, and how he very clearly states that he's not a man who can, like, alcohol affects him more than other men, he says, and we all have our weaknesses and things, but just the way that Iago manipulates Cassio into being the worst version of himself, that Cassio clearly states right at the beginning of that scene, it's like, I can't do this because I know myself and I know that I can't. And he gets tricked into drinking, and it produces exactly the result that Iago intends. And I'm always so struck by Cassio's line, and Brandon Carter played it here at the American Shakespeare Center beautifully, but it was just the devil wrath, or the devil drunkenness is given way to the devil wrath, which is just one vice replaces another. And I really found the first time I experienced Keene in the reading, I was really stuck on the self-sabotage idea, where it's just, well, the man put alcohol into his body and he made bad decisions, and like, how is that, and like, I remember struggling with this, and then I rehearsed Othello, and then I saw this scene happen, and it's just, the vices in ourselves are also us inviting evil into our bodies in a way that comes from a sense of not being deserving of good sometimes. And I think that Shakespeare saw something in that sort of communal drinking experience, which is, not to burst anybody's bubbles, tends to exist in the theater. That is a way of sort of us socializing. And I just never had seen that. And I thought that the way that plays so heavily into Tyler's downfall. I mean, I felt very much aligned with him and Cassio in that moment. And I loved that Tyler then wasn't just existing as the sort of Othello of the play. He existed as many of the characters manipulated by people in Othello, including Desdemona. I don't think it's fair to say that Kai is the Desdemona and that Tyler is the Othello. It's such a cool hybrid of all of the really fascinating and complex relationships in Othello. So I think I'm actually inverting the answer and saying what I learned more about. But
so. What's interesting about this question is that I actually didn't really know Othello that well until we did it this season, and we did that Keene reading, and I was in both of those readings last year. So I actually really came into the Othello process with Keene on the brain, so some of the things that happen in Keene, I sort of took with me into that process. And, this idea of wanting something so much that you kind of destroy it because you're so scared. And I think that's kind of what happens to, and I play Bianca in Othello, so I wasn't in it so much, but I listened to the whole show like 30 times. And so, I think that at the end of the show, I think in Keene, Tyler, when he's Ira Aldridge, says something like Othello's downfall is that he loves too much, that he loves so much that he ends up destroying that thing that he loves. And it was really fun and kind of cool to listen to that scene every night and be like, oh gosh, in his mind, I think Othello was so scared and so worried that something like this would happen that when he thinks that it did, he immediately jumps to the worst conclusion and then goes ahead and destroys his whole life. And that manipulation part of it is just so scary and sad. But, having listened to Othello so many times, now I sort of understand more of the thematic parts of Keene that are taken from Othello as well.
Yeah. Well, piggybacking off of that, and also what Zoe said as well, the alcohol also stood out to me both in the play Shakespeare's and yours, Felicia, because as I mentioned at the beginning of this, the coping mechanism, right? You apparently witnessed it at the conference that you went to, in terms of just the way that people deal with managing the anxiety and the frenzied energy that comes with being in this space where so much of it is very, very intellectually stimulating, but at the same time, it's also this environment that is incredibly competitive, even though people like to pretend that it's not. And so that, I thought, was just a really nice intersection there that you made in terms of thinking about the impact that alcohol has and the way that it's used in these spaces. And then the other thing I would say in terms of answering Anne's question and the viewer's question directly, my perception of what love is doing in this play changed when I brought Keene together with Othello, thinking about Othello the play and then Othello the character. And so, there's that line that love is Othello's tragedy. And yes, the characters, but in terms of the plays, right? If we think about what is it that the white people in this play love, they love the access that they have to power. Iago loves his racism in particular. And it seems like there's also this love for the game of trying to stabilize what whiteness is. So I just thought that was really unique in sort of changing my perception of what Othello does in conversation with your play, Felicia.
I love that. I think that distinction between Othello, the character, and Othello, the play, is a really important one to sort of keep in our minds as we're having this conversation. I see that Nikki has a raised hand. Nikki, I'm going to allow you to talk if you'd like to ask your question.
Well, my original question is why the title Keene for this play, but I don't know if that's been answered. But I have another question. I believe Othello's love is very abusive. I mean, he's a very abusive character because true love, there's that pathological element where he turns so violently towards Desdemona, ultimately killing her, is a horrible act. And so I don't deem it as this great love.
Thank you, Nikki. So 2 questions there, I think. One, and a couple people have asked this, so why the title of Keene? And then I think sort of a broader question about the way in which love can be violent or destructive in Othello, and how we maybe see that in Keene as well.
Yeah, so the title, for me, there's a sort of like central plot mystery around him reclaiming his stage name Aldridge, and that sort of invented fictional arc of the play of modeling himself after Edmund Keene and taking the name Keene and then reclaiming Aldridge when he has to go on for Keene, and the mystery of why he sort of bills himself as Senegalese. But also, in many ways, that name came to symbolize to me how Aldridge aligned himself with whiteness and with white excellence as a means of sort of validating himself as part of the white canon. And in many ways, I felt like it's a comment on kind of what the play is both doing and subverting, in that it's an adaptation or like a riff on part of the white canon and seeking to subvert it simultaneously, which I think is what Aldridge was doing with claiming that name for himself. But also I liked the title because it's like referential it's sort of like 3 stages of referential. You sort of have to know like Aldridge and then Edmund Keene and then sort of like the performance history of Shakespeare to understand what the title is. So I liked that it was sort of referential, and part of the experience of watching the play is you come to understand what the title means. And then in terms of Othello's love being violent, one of the things that we've been talking a lot about in this seminar is the psychic cost on the actor playing Othello of embodying this sort of violent love, or embodying the sort of like Orientalist, exoticist hodgepodge that Shakespeare thrusts on this character, and trying to add psychological complexity to something that relies on all of these sort of violent racist tropes. And I think that, part of like the scene where Ira, I don't want to say willfully misinterprets, but decides on an interpretation of the play that isn't about Othello reverting to his natural state of baseness, it speaks to sort of like Aldridge's practice of reclaiming roles and refiguring like what the noble Moor was for himself, as an adaptive practice, but also as a coping mechanism, because he just got repeatedly cast as these sort of barbarous heathens. And I kept thinking about what the psychic cost of that would be on him as a person, while he was trying to sort of solidify himself in this white canon. So yeah, that's sort of part of, like whether or not it's a valid reading of the play or a willful misinterpretation on Aldridge's part is something that the play sort of throws up as a question.
And I would add to, just in terms of thinking about this conversation around the topic of love, marriages in particular were not treated in Shakespeare's time as they were or are in ours. And so I think it's important to consider the historical context of, the fact that we go to the beginning of the play, right? Iago and Rodrigo are letting Brabantio know that he's been robbed. And so Desdemona is treated as this possession, and women were often treated as property and girls. So daughters were the property of their fathers and wives were the property of their husbands. And so I think that's one of the ways we can sort of make sense of how Othello ends up treating Desdemona the way he does. It is a destruction of his property. But beyond that, I think we can't forget about the racism in the play and the fact that it is Iago's racism and just the racism of this society that really drives what happens between Othello and Desdemona. Othello does not get to be a person, essentially. We don't really hear him. We don't really see him. That makes me think of Keith Hamilton Cobb's American Moor. We don't really hear and see Othello, and neither do the characters in the play. And they're probably the biggest culprits, I think. And that's the saddest part of Othello for me.
There's also a level of toxic masculinity that's present in Othello too, that goes really hand in hand with the racism. And I feel like while primarily it is the racism that is the primary poison in Othello, that element of masculinity never, I can't listen to that play, watch that play, read that play without seeing that everywhere. And it seems like Desdemona sort of presents herself and enters that world as defying the roles and expectations of a woman in her position. You know, it is totally unheard of for Desdemona to walk into the Senate and say, no, I don't want to stay behind. I want to go with him to the war. That's not at all the gender norm for a wife. It's like, you know, and her argument is, well, if I stay behind, a moth of peace, then all of the rights for which I married him are denied me. It's like, yeah, you know, like a wife, that's your job. You know, so every step of the way, she becomes more of this sort of, you know, independent woman that totally defies what is expected of her in her age. And Iago uses that. And in fact, when Othello is talking about, well, these are all the reasons for which I love her, she could sing the, I can't remember the word, the violence out of a bear or something like that. And he's like, yeah, exactly. She's an unkept woman, you know, so it is her, and it's his use of her femininity in contrast to be a man, Othello, this woman's getting out of hand, that I think ties in a lot to the violence between the two of them at the end. And the fact that he does murder her in a very intimate way. You know, I've said this a few times, of the beginning of that play ends beginning so broadly on the street and public, and then finishing in the intimate confines of a bed. You know, I mean, the gender discussion there, I think, really bowls me over.
For sure.
Yeah, I think there's something, sorry. No. There's something really sad to me about how there's like an attempt in Othello to defy some of those norms that society puts on these characters, and especially Othello, but also Desdemona, in marrying a Black man and going to the war. And then the way that Iago then manipulates both of them into like sort of reverting back to what society expects of a marriage and of a woman and of a Black person, and then how that manipulation kind of destroys this attempt to defy the societal norms that are at work and the racism that's at work in the play.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I mean, and all of that is about essentially, you know, on one level, maintaining racial purity, right? Brabantio accuses Desdemona of treason of the blood. And if that doesn't tell us a whole lot, you know, I don't know what does in this play.
I'm just so inspired by all of this conversation. We are nearing the end of our time. So I want to ask one final question, and I'm struggling a little bit to grasp at it because there are a couple really interesting things in the chat, asking further questions about parallels between Keene and Othello, asking about the final moments of the play, asking about the conversation between Keene and American Moor and other Shakespeare responses. So I think if I'm going to try and like condense all of these into one final question, what is at the heart for you of the conversation that these plays are having with one another as dramatic works in dialogue. Big question to wrap things up.
Are you talking about Shakespeare's play and Keene, or are you talking about
so I think we can go either way. I think if you, I know some of you know American Moor or Red Velvet or any number of other sort of adjacent Shakespeare responses. So if you want to respond to the question in terms of what is this conversation that's happening between these contemporary works at large and Othello, but if you're coming from a place that's more sort of intimately focused on just Othello and Keene, you can tackle it from that angle.
Okay, got it.
I think for me, what I've been thinking about while we've been talking about this is, this idea of white excellence and attempting to, live up to the excellence that whiteness sort of puts on you, and it being unable to do that ever as a person of color, and just always kind of being up against something you can never achieve. And I think that really speaks to me as an Asian American person specifically, and a biracial person, that, there's always an attempt among the Asian American community to try and become so good in the white people's eyes that they won't treat us like we're less than, but you can't be white, you just become invisible. And I think that happens in Othello as well, like this attempt of Othello to be, noble and, the good Moor or whatever, and then his inability to achieve what comes so easily to white people is at the center of his destruction at the end.
I like that. For me, I guess I would say that, among the three that I know, so Keene, American Moor, and Othello, as we move away from Shakespeare's play and into these more 21st century plays, I like how they get us away from, this term was used earlier in our talk, the elitism of it all. And my parents actually watched your play, the reading, the other night as well, Felicia. And, I talked to my mom the next day, and her response was, poor Tyler. She was like, they really put him through it. And I'm like, you get it. Like, you that's it. Like, in a nutshell, that's it, right? We need to feel bad for Tyler. And when we talk about the they that put him through it, like, it's so clear, it's the white people in this society of the play that just put him through the ringer and make his life challenging, make it difficult. And so I love that about these newer productions that are doing what good theater should do, which is what Shakespeare's theater did in his time, right? You make things accessible for people, but your work and Cobb's work as well, and others, that activist component that it has is crucial, especially right now as we think about Black Lives Matter and all of these other sort of heinous things that are happening in our society.
Yeah, I just wanted to also touch on, like, thinking about where this play exists in terms of like the canon of Othello adaptations, contemporary Othello adaptations. And I think in various ways, all of those plays are about the sort of psychic and sociological cost of what we have chosen to canonize, and whose voices we've chosen to elevate, not just in the Western world, but sort of in global culture. And I think part of what I hope to do with this play is draw a particular spotlight on, in academia and in sort of the body of critical theory that we've built up around Shakespeare, what that psychological and sociological cost is, even within the subculture of people who do that for a living, who think about Shakespeare for a living, what it means that we've chosen to elevate this dead white British guy to such a place of predominance in our culture. And in doing that, drawing focus on the sort of voices and stories and the suffering that goes on because of what we've chosen to canonize that people might not have thought about, or those stories that might have not been written or heard because of who we chose to canonize.
Well, I'm not going to talk after the playwright does. So, like, I support and encourage everyone else's comments and think everyone is a genius. And genius is irrefutable. And she already wrote that. So, like, great.
Excellent. Well, I wish I could talk to the four of you about this play for much, much longer, but I will reluctantly pass the moderating baton back to Nathan. Thank you all so, so much. And thank you to Red Bull for giving us the space for this conversation.
Thank you, everybody. It was such a fascinating conversation to watch and listen to. Thank you all for... as always, just going, which is great. It's really important that we do it, and thank you all so much. I'm going to talk a little bit about all the other things you can see at Red Bull. You guys can stick around or not, but for all of you who are listening, once again, you have a little less than 24 hours to watch Keene again, or to get your friends and family to watch Keene. So please do that. It's been mentioned a couple times on this program that we're doing an ongoing seminar series on Othello with a room of all BIPOC actors, playwrights, and scholars, including Felicia. And that this coming Wednesday, that's from 2 to 3:30 this coming Wednesday. That's the fourth and final one, but all of them are available to be seen in their entirety on Red Bull's YouTube page and on the website if you wish to catch up, or if you can't catch it live, those will last in perpetuity. So please do check them out. They're fascinating, no holds barred conversation, and it's really, really great. No pun intended on barred, though I wish I had. And then after that, we're taking what for Red Bull is a bit of a breather, i.e. we're taking like 2.5 weeks before our next thing. Our next thing will be, we're going to premiere a new translation of Ano Caro's, apology if I messed up that pronunciation, The Courage to Right a Woman's Wrongs, which is a Spanish classical play, which we're presenting in association with UCLA's Diversifying the Classics initiative. And that's directed by Melia Ben-Susan. So please do look for that, and there will be a bowl session with that as well. That's vote. If you want to torture yourself, watch the debate in half an hour, but more importantly, vote. Vote early, vote whenever. Thank you all. Have a wonderful night, and we will see you soon. Bye all.